Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Sustainable Practices Research Group event, exhibition, and panel debate. I'm delighted to see so many people here, and thank you all for coming. I'm David North. I'm Director of the Sustainable Consumption Institute at the University of Manchester. I'm delighted to say, and I really do mean this, that we have an absolutely first-class panel for this, for this discussion. Time is going to be a little bit tight, so particularly when we get to the discussion and questions part of it, I'm sort of begging you to be a bit disciplined in the way that you ask your questions, and then we'll get as many in as we can. After that, we'll then break and move into a reception in the other rooms. Now, I hope you've had a good chance to look around the exhibition this afternoon. As colleagues from the SPRG will have explained, it's the culmination of 3 years of intensive research funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, with contributions from DEFRA and indeed from the Scottish Government. And the Sustainable Practices Research Group is a collaboration between 7 UK universities led out of the University of Manchester. And I know that my academic colleagues who have been involved in the SPRG's work really want me to emphasise that this isn't the end of that work. What today represents is an opportunity to present the insights from the work so that they can be scrutinised, tested, debated, and hopefully over time applied by policymakers and indeed by businesses and by others. And that's why it is, as I say, so exciting to have such a distinguished panel with colleagues from top-level leadership roles in government, in business, NGOs, and academia. And in fact, really interesting looking closely at our panel, how all of them have sort of straddled different areas over their careers. Now, final word from me at this stage is I think this work couldn't be any more important, really. Until a year or so ago, my role was not that dissimilar from Mike Barry's at M&S, because I led the sustainability work and climate change work at Tesco. And a little bit like Marks and Spencer, we began to highlight and champion the role that consumers could play and perhaps have to play on sustainability if we're going to reach the targets that collectively that we've set, whether that's through everyday actions or whatever. Now, I'll confess, and I suspect, I'll leave Mike to say what he'll say on behalf of Marks and Spencer, but I'll confess that I don't think we made as much progress as we probably would have liked to have made when we set out on that journey. We can all point to individual initiatives and milestones, but the reality for me on sustainability is that the sort of unsustainable lives that we lead sort of march inexorably on. We haven't yet unlocked the way to change consumption or what I would call consumer behaviour. So I think if I were to sort of say to the panel that we've got this evening, one question it would be, help us to unlock the way towards low carbon consumption and behaviour. Now, to start us off, Professor Dale Southerton on my left is going to outline what I believe is the distinctive approach that SPRG has developed, and why he believes it can make such a major contribution to policy and to practice. Dale's Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester and is indeed the Director of SPRG. He's also the Research Director of the Sustainable Consumption Institute and is therefore a close colleague of mine. So, Dale.
Thank you, David. So we all know that climate change raises a critical challenge for contemporary societies, one that requires, amongst other things, a reduction of the resource intensity of everyday ways of life and its patterns and trajectories of consumption. And the work of the SPRG addresses this challenge, offering what I would say is a distinctive perspective for understanding, explaining and addressing consumption and everyday life. And I think it's important to start with the notion of consumption, because a fundamental premise of SPRG's approach is to recognise that people consume in order to engage in practices. And this is actually a critical point. All too often, consumption is reduced to an analysis of what people buy or the symbolic properties of goods and services. Ideas like conspicuous consumption or consumption as a means of communicating identity are important, but they only scrape the surface of why people consume in particular ways. Many of the most resource-intensive forms of consumption can hardly be explained simply in terms of the symbolic properties of goods and services. For example, people rarely consume electricity in order to signify their identities, and the ubiquity of resource-intensive goods like freezers and washing machines, or even the emergence of air conditioning, are difficult to explain in terms of their conspicuous properties. It's also not enough to explain these forms of ordinary and inconspicuous consumption in terms of the usefulness, or perhaps the utility value, of goods like, for example, the freezer. If we want to explain why societies shift in directions where more and more resource-intensive patterns of consumption become necessary to live a normal life, then we need to ask different kinds of questions. For example, and to stick with my case of the freezer and frozen food, we need to be asking questions like, why did the freezer come to be normal? What changed to make it so important to our daily lives? And could we imagine a different form of social organisation in which that device is perhaps less necessary or even irrelevant? And it's questions like these, ignored by conventional explanations of consumption, that the research of SPRG has addressed. For example, our research has explored how eating habits change in different cultural contexts, focusing especially on how Anglo-French couples negotiate foreign culinary cultures. We've examined international variations in the consumption of bottled and tap water, and how they are shaped by particular environmental, political, and economic histories. We've looked at how people use water in their homes, and more specifically, what variations of practices lead to differential patterns of water consumption. We've explored how air conditioning is emerging and finding its way into the UK built environment, together with an apparent convergence of UK indoor temperatures around 22 degrees Celsius. And we've examined how standards for zero carbon are being built into new homes, and what kinds of everyday practices are, or are not, being imagined in these zero carbon futures. SPRG's projects approach these questions through a perspective that is distinct from the behavioural change approaches that I suspect most people in this audience are familiar with. And our perspective focuses on the social organisation of practices. So for the remainder of the few minutes that I have, I want to set out in very basic terms what we mean by a social practices perspective, why we feel it offers a critical way of addressing the challenge of sustainable consumption, and I want to end with some comments about the broader policy implications of our research. My aim is to complement the exhibition that you've already had a look at and the overview pack, which I hope many of you will be taking home with you tonight. So what do we mean by social practices? Well, because consumption occurs in order to engage in practices, it is practices that we need to analyse. And a simple definition of practices are that they are blocks of activities that people share, and it's the sharedness that I want to emphasise. In its simplest sense, many practices require the co-participation of others to be performed in any satisfactory way. This means social practices are all practices are inherently social and subject to often context-specific rules and conventions of social interaction. But for SPRG, the more important inference of shared is that social practices are recognisable entities because sufficiently large numbers of people perform them either at the same time, but not necessarily together, so if you think of rush hour commuting, or they perform them in broadly similar ways. It is through shared social practices that patterns of consumption are formed, and that particular ways of life become meaningful, and as a consequence, are faithfully and routinely reproduced by people in their day-to-day lives. thinking of practices as recognisable entities also highlights that practices are socially organised. Otherwise, there would not be enough common features, or elements as we call them, for people to recognise them as being practices. So, blocks of activities are therefore recognisable as a practice through the elements that organise it, even to those people who do not perform that practice. We know what driving is, even if we don't drive a car. We can identify 3 generic elements that represent the basic conditions for the existence of any social practice. These elements are materials, which include the objects, the tools, the technologies, and the infrastructures, the physical stuff that make any practice possible. The second element is competence, which is knowledge, skills, following particular procedures, norms, or rules to perform a practice adequately. And meanings, which includes cultural conventions, value systems, expectations, and understandings. Thinking in terms of these generic elements is important because doing so suggests that practices are interconnected. They are interconnected because they share the same elements, infrastructures being the most obvious example. And because the existence of one practice, and also because the existence of any one practice has implications for the performance of others. For example, if we want to encourage the practice of commuter cycling, it requires not only the provision of appropriate bicycle infrastructures, but also, probably, the provision of showers in the workplace and a shift in cultural conventions regarding workplaces and workplace practices. That practices are interconnected highlights the potential for change in one element, or for change in one specific practice, to provoke shifts across a whole suite of related practices. So taking these basic premises of the social practice perspective, SPRG's research has sought to empirically test, scrutinise and advance our understandings of how practices emerge and disappear, how they persist and change, and how they vary across cultures and societies. I'm not going to attempt to try and summarise the key findings. As you'll have seen for yourself, they're wide and varied. But I do want to conclude with some very brief observations about what our perspective suggests, with regards to policy interventions at least, for encouraging more sustainable practices. Our research argues that to change patterns of everyday life, we need to look beyond conventional accounts of behaviour change and of consumption. Questions about how sustainable consumption can be encouraged through policy interventions can, we argue, be effectively reframed by taking social practices as the principal unit of analysis and as sites for intervention. As our recent report on interventions in practice argues, such a reframing would lead to greater recognition that systematic and coordinated policy frameworks which seek to affect suites of practices are needed. The greatest gains will be found where changes fostered in particular practices, or the elements that those practices share, are likely to spill over and positively affect other related practices. Secondly, we need to recognise that habits and routines are cultural and certainly not personal, and they are definitely not the irrational deficiencies of human action. Rather, they are formed and sustained through the organisation of practices. If you change how practices are organised, then you change habits and routines, the sticky forms of behaviour that policymakers find difficult to shift. Thirdly, practices are always changing, whether or not there are deliberative interventions seeking to influence them. Since such trajectories of practice already exist, it makes sense to ask how they might be guided in more sustainable directions. This is a different approach to that of designing one-off interventions to promote more sustainable behaviour, and one that demands visions of more sustainable future practices rather than a more sustainable version of a static present. And finally, this means a new evidence base is required, one focused on accounting for varieties of practices rather than which primarily focuses on the environmental impact of particular goods or the purchasing patterns and attitudes of aggregated individual consumers. And I think this last point is particularly important. David often challenges me, quite rightly, about what does this actually mean. Give us an example of what you mean when you say change the social organisation of practices. And so the example I often give is one around online food shopping. You can smile, David, because we've had this debate. So how online food shopping and delivery could unlock changes in a wide range of daily practices. I'm not going to give you my talk, which included a suggestion that Tesco's converts its supermarkets into big laundrettes, but we'll leave that. So in my answer, I'll go on to suggest that wide-scale, collectively coordinated systems of food deliveries could reduce the amount of car travel. It could perhaps eliminate the use of freezers. It could influence what people put on their plates. Maybe it could encourage the re-emergence of a range of other collective domestic services, such as laundry systems. The absolutely pertinent question that is then asked back to me is whether such a shift would be more sustainable. And my reply is that we simply don't know. Our policy questions and the evidence base the policy draws on are focused on how to change individual consumer choices and the relative sustainability of particular products, and not on the social organisation of practices or how different systems of organisation could yield more sustainable futures. SPRG has made an important contribution in initiating this new evidence base and in trying to reveal how practices emerge, persist and change. Now, I started by saying that the practice perspective is distinctive, but actually the more important point is that it is a perspective that provides a systematic framework for tackling everyday patterns of resource-intensive consumption. And if we are to meet the challenges posed by climate change, then systematic and persistent, not piecemeal and one-off, approaches are desperately needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dale. And I'm now going to hand over to the next of our members of our panel, Lord O'Donnell. Gus was Cabinet Secretary, Head of the Civil Service from 2005 until 2011, as you'll all know. Before that, he had a truly distinguished career in government, including as Permanent Secretary to the Treasury. I think probably slightly less well known in your career, and sort of pertinent to this discussion, Gus, is your earlier time as an academic, including as a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and indeed currently as visiting professor at the LSE. But also very pertinent to this discussion is the fact that you chaired the government's behavioural insights team, the nudge unit, as a legendary nudge unit, and remain a keen advocate of its work, and I think that's relevant to what you're going to talk about.
Thank you. We've been asked to be brief, so Dale got twice as long as we're getting, so I will try and keep brief. First of all, I think all of the things I see out there are great work and really important contributions. And so all my comments should be borne in mind with that. I think this is great and we should have more of it. The first thing that I kind of struggle with is what's it all for? So you take sustainability as the all and end all, and actually certainly I think we could all agree that we would not want the Earth to be on an unsustainable path. But amongst the sustainable paths, there are a very large number. How do we choose what's the best sustainable path for the world, as it were? And within that, we need to think about how are you going to decide. Now, there's a certain group of people that say we should do this through maximising people's subjective well-being. There's a certain group of, how shall I put it, rather old-fashioned economists that would want to maximise world GDP or something crazy like that. I think they're dying out, I'm glad to say, and that's kind of left behind. But that whole question about what constitutes a good society, which is a lot more, and I've just come back from a session in New York where we launched the Second World Happiness Report with people like Jeff Sachs talking about what are we thinking about, what is it we're trying to achieve, are we trying to achieve increasing individuals' subjective feelings about their life satisfaction, about their feelings of pleasure and pain. Are we thinking about what is known in the trade as eudaimonics, which is having a good and flourishing life, and how do we put all of these things together? The reason this matters is because it kind of gives you a way of assessing different policy options and different ways of looking at the world. And that, I think, is the bit that I have on top. So let's just kind of, that's the discussion we want to have. Then we get down to let's a bit more nitty-gritty about, okay, so we've got some idea about what we're trying to achieve. How do we do it? Now, if you're the academic economist that I started off on, it's completely straightforward. We have a utility function, which is, in the old days, a function of consumption. You maximize your consumption, subject to your budget constraint, boom, that's bliss, right? We all know there are lots and lots of things wrong with that, but the one thing I'd say that Dick Thaler and the nudge people kind of pointed out in a slightly roundabout way, but they don't do it directly because they wanted to get into the behaviour change, which is the kind of nub of what they're trying to get to, is the fundamental assumption that they're breaking down from classical economics is the fact that preferences are given, right? That's what you're doing. You're saying, actually, we don't want to accept models where we take people's individual preferences as given. Now, that has all sorts of implications, particularly for governments who are worried about being told the nanny state. Who are you to tell me what I want? But in fact, governments do that from the moment that we start doing education policy, so I don't think that's as big a boundary as people have. So we're into this world where we're trying to say, can we come up with a set of ways of influencing, changing people's preferences in a way that leads to, for example, a more sustainable world and leads to better outcomes for society as a whole and the individuals within them. So that gets you into the whole behaviour change. Now, I really do not like the phrase behavioural economics, mainly because I think it's a misnomer. The whole point, and I think what Dale has said at great length there, what all these examples tell us, is that it's not the kind of classical economic model really doesn't give you any answers to all of this. What we need to be talking about is what are the social practices that mean in some countries you have bottled water and some others you don't. And I think to answer those sorts of questions, we need many of the things that Dale was talking about, but actually, to be honest, I was listening to a sociologist, and it was very much the sociologists look at it. The economists would start off and say, well, it's all about price. And we need to bring all of the different professions together, the psychologists, the sociologists, the anthropologists, lots and the philosophers, to get us to understand this whole thing. And part of the problem is that well, there are two big issues. I say one, first of all, we tend to be organised very much in silos. So if I go to a university and I talk about behaviour change, the one group that probably won't turn up will be the economists, right? Which is interesting. Most of the other professions are interested. The economists have got it all sussed. They don't need to listen, right? That's quite interesting in itself. If you go into government, you'll get certain prejudices which are there, and trying to get across departmental boundaries, for example, is also very difficult. So you need to find ways of getting the different disciplines to come together and have a common language as well. I mean, the jargon is unbelievable. We've all got different ways of talking about these things, and it would be good if we could change them. What happened, just to give you a couple of examples, in the behavioural insight team, what I wanted to do was start off this idea that actually it was a valid thing for government to change behaviour. Now, when you get a government coming in who've said the biggest problem facing society is 11% deficit to GDP ratio, you're going to come up with some ideas that cut the deficit. That way you're going to get political acceptance to them. So many of the first things we did generated more revenue for governments and found ways to cut it down. And the interesting thing, the reason it took off so much is because most of these changes were very cheap. And most of them turned out to be, if you like in the jargon, win-wins. So one of the classic ones that we came up with in the sustainability area was, so how are we going to reduce energy consumption? The classic economist treasury answer was, well, the best thing to do is to make energy efficiency something that people want to do for themselves. They'll choose, given their existing preferences and existing prices. So if it's homes, let's make loft insulation cheaper. Brilliant idea, complete failure. Doesn't do anything, right? People don't insulate their lofts just because of the price. So when the nudge team looked at it, what we ended up doing was not having a a policy about the price. We didn't go on the price side. We went on, if you like, you might call it social customs or whatever, but we basically used the phrase that has become the common core of how do you change behaviour, keep it simple. The reason people didn't want to insulate their lofts is because they had a lot of rubbish in their lofts and it takes a lot of effort. So we did a loft clearance scheme. People come in, clear out your loft, which is very, people like that, and while it's clear, we insulate it. That programme, far more effective, ending up now with no government subsidy, reducing energy consumption, reducing CO2 emissions, and the individuals are better off in a purely economic sense, hopefully in many other senses as well. And they've discovered that they had a Rembrandt in the loft. How good is that? So you can have these behavioural insight that come in, but they require you to think about things in a much broader way. And we need to get the other disciplines, apart from economics, much more interested in influencing public policy and much more influential in influencing government policy. And so that's why I strongly welcome the kinds of things that are here and the approaches that you've come up with, because I think there are some really innovative ideas there which could easily be incorporated. And when you think about changing customs and all the rest of it, we have certain social norms that from a government point of view are we think are really holding back society, and it would be good to get at those. And we know that the answers to these things require multidisciplinary approaches, of which the examples in the exhibition are some fascinating ways of going at this. So, good for you.
Thank you very much, Gus. Our next panellist is David Nussbaum, Chief Executive of WWF-UK since May 2007. David also chairs the global WWF, Global Climate and Energy Initiative. Before that was Chief Executive of Transparency International. And the sort of interesting additional fact I found, David, is you actually had a really interesting career in business before that, in accountancy and manufacturing, and indeed as a finance director. So again, sort of straddling, slightly related to the point you just made, Gus, about how do we get the sort of different disciplines working together a bit more. So over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, I've enjoyed reading some of the research and looking at the exhibition. I want to start by just reminding us of the scale of the challenge here. One way of looking at that, which WWF uses, is to say if we look at humanity's demands on planet Earth and we try and measure that, we can work out how many planet Earths do we need to provide all the stuff we consume and absorb all the waste we create. And at the moment, globally, we need about 1.5 planets. That's obviously a bit of a problem, because we've only got the one. And there's another problem, which is that if everybody lived like we do here in Britain, we'd need sort of 2.5 planets or more. And if everybody lived like they do in the States, where of course air conditioning is pretty popular, then we might need 4 planets. And at the moment we've got screens all around the world, ranging from huge cinema screens to tiny phone screens. And what we're imprinting on billions of minds is the appeal of a Western European or North American lifestyle. So we are ramping up the expectations of the lifestyles people would want. So that's a huge threat to sustainability. Quite a bit of that, by the way, is carbon. So if we can crack the carbon challenge, that will help a lot. But it's a pretty big scale challenge. So I have sort of 2 challenges back, as it were, to the work we've seen. The first is, so how do you use this research to create the political space and pressure that we need to get the changes we need to happen? Thinking of David Mackay at Energy and Climate Change, who wrote a very good book about energy, he talks about the need to do things at scale. And now that David's left Tesco, maybe we can say, every little helps. Well, it does, but it only helps a little. And if we're going to make the kind of changes we need and reduce our carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, that isn't a little, it's a lot. And so that's a big challenge, particularly to politicians and indeed to business leaders, as Mike may talk about. What am I allowed to do? How far can I go before I lose the support that I need from the electorate or from my shareholders or from my staff or my customers or whatever? So how can all this wonderful work be used to open up the political space and pressure? And then the second challenge, that's a sort of very practical challenge, I suppose, but my second one's rather different, and I suppose this reflects my own, combination of business and NGOs, big global problems and so on. So the second challenge is about, so what is virtuous behaviour, if that's the right word? I'm not sure virtuous is the right word, but for the moment. And in particular, what values are we going to appeal to in order to get people to behave in the way we think they need to behave? They, plural. I mean, social groups and so on. And WWF has led some work called Common Cause, which has been exploring the question of motivation and what values we appeal to in people when we try and get them to do the things we think we need them to do. So let me give you one or two sort of instances of the kinds of issues I'm after here. Supposing we've heard about loft insulation, what about bulbs? Put in low energy bulbs, you'll save money. Great. Now, is that more sustainable? Well, it might be. Depends what you do with the money you save. If you use the money you save to have an extra weekend away in southern Spain, then actually this is horrendous in terms of resource consumption. Instead of a little bit more electricity at home, we've now got, all kinds of resources being used for your extra weekend in the south of Spain. Not that I'm, against weekends, occasional weekends in the south of Spain. So we've got to think about that. Or another example I like, if we say, look, drive a Prius because Leonardo DiCaprio drives a Prius, we are reinforcing the idea that what you should aspire to is to be like Leonardo DiCaprio. Imagine what happens to the planet if everybody lives like, So this is a big challenge to us, and one of the things this work has done that we've led on has to look at how can we appeal to pro-social behaviour values, the values that encourage people right across the board, not just on sustainability but on all other kinds of pro-social behaviours. That if we appeal to those values, you can trigger more actions on the basis of those values. Whereas if we appeal to save money, you'll have more cash to spend on whatever it is you want to spend it on, that will reinforce values which are about me and my interests now for immediate consumption, I suppose. And we have seen, if we think about the reaction to forests and the proposed sell-off of the forests, whatever you think about the reaction and whether it was rational and so on or not, something came out there a couple of years ago, which was how much people value forests, and they probably valued them quite a lot than the government economists who did the sums that said selling it off would be a good idea. So we need to think about that and how to build up the systemic pressure, the systemic willingness to change, the systemic pro-social behaviour that will underpin the kinds of changes we need to see. So my two challenges: how do we get to implementation at scale, and how do we reinforce pro-social values and pro-social behaviours in the way we appeal to people to do the things we need to get us all to do.
Thank you very much, David. I'm resisting commenting on all these sort of Tesco points. I've moved on from Tesco. Mike Barry is head of sustainable business at Marks and Spencer. Now, Mike was a really central member of the M&S team that developed the company's truly iconic Plan A on sustainability, which I think now was about 6 years ago that was launched, Mike, I'm thinking back. As a result of that, in 2011, Mike was named The Guardian's inaugural Sustainable Business Innovator of the year. And I think, Mike, you're currently leading M&S's work to deliver Plan A across the globe, or across M&S's businesses in countries across the world. So,
David, thank you.
Barry.
And let me just start by going back to David and saying what a great job he did at Tesco's, because I've got a contention, unbeknown to a lot of people in Britain, a lot of big businesses have changed radically in the last 10 years. Tesco's, Sainsbury's, Unilever, Coke, McDonald's, to name but a few, behind the scenes, and the supply chains, the factories and the farms they've used, have made some quite significant savings environmentally and socially. It's really good news. But as we've seen at Marks & Spencer, in exactly the same way, it's not enough. For all the reasons that David's just framed next to me, there is not enough stuff on the planet to keep us going consuming as we do. And I say that as a shopkeeper. Marks & Spencer sells 2.9 billion items a year. Piece of food, piece of clothing, an apple, an orange, a ready meal, it could be a suit, a tie, a pair of socks. 2.9 billion items of stuff. Walmart's 25 times bigger than M&S. It's probably shifting 100 billion items a year. There's about 1 billion of us on the planet that drive consumption. In America, in Japan, in Europe, in the UK. Rightly, the people of China, Russia, Brazil, India, South Africa, Mexico aspire to what we have today, and they will reach that very rapidly. And we predict there'll be roughly 3 billion middle-class consumers on the planet within 20 years. Now, if there's 100 billion items of clothing sold on the planet today, can we have a world where we've got 300 billion items of clothing being consumed as we do in the West today? Probably not. And we're starting to see a canary in the coal mine effect. We're starting to see a cost pressure coming through in the supply chains as people compete for finite resources. But come what may, just focusing as Marks & Spencer, Tesco's and others have done on largely reducing the impact of our production is not enough. We have to confront consumption. Now, the traditional way you would have done that said, look, 21 million people in our shops every week, 87% of them care about the future. They are good people. And don't believe that M&S has got some uniquely green middle-class consumer that cares more than anybody else's. Tesco's will have a similar number right across the marketplace. The numbers differ maybe 5% between a more sort of middle England brand like M&S and somebody that's selling it at a different price point. But it's 5%, not 50%. People do care. But what people tell us is, it's got to start with you. Before you start giving me lectures, M&S, about consuming differently, consuming better, let's see that you, Marks & Spencer, Tesco's, Walmart, the British government, the European Union, whoever it may be, have put your own house in order as best you can, and then you've got my permission to knock on my door. And I don't think enough businesses and enough in government have demonstrated how committed they are yet to get that sort of consumer permission. That then takes you on to the second thing you do. Once you've proved that you're serious about this, you do something called brand editing. You start to take away the bad choices from consumers, largely unbeknownst to them. Eggs, there used to be battery eggs, we made all ours free range 6, 7, 8 years ago. Coffee and tea all became fair trade. But it was still the coffee and tea that we sold at the same price point, same high quality coffee and tea. So you started to nudge people to a different place without them actively having to do anything differently. They still came to M&S, they still paid the same amount of money for the same product. But then, again, that is still not enough. There's still different things that you need to do to take the consumer on the journey. And let me just offer 2 minor case studies just to illustrate the point before I'll sort of pass the floor. Firstly, carry bags. 5, 6, 7 years ago, the UK retailers collectively were giving out about 13 billion plastic bags a year, many of them which were just being used for 10, 20 minutes before they're being thrown away. It was wasteful. We wanted to confront it. We asked people at the till point, do you want a bag? If you thought about using a bag for life, we reduced bag usage by 10, 15, 20%. It wasn't much. We then took the brave decision to unilaterally introduce a 5p charge for the carry bag in our food halls, and it was quite controversial. A number of people were very concerned about it. I've just spent all this money with you, M&S, and now you're charging me for a bag. I think that's outrageous. But most people stuck with it because we were very clear that the profits from it were going to charity. So you were doing something, you were changing your behaviour. I couldn't unfortunately give you a reward for it, but I could make sure that there was no profit to me, and the money that you did spend was going to help WWF protect the marine environment and help MCS protect the beaches and seas of the UK. So again, a difference that could be achieved. What that then did is gave a degree of confidence to a number of governments around the British Isles, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, now in Scotland, to introduce national carry bag charging, so everybody's charged consistently, not just M&S taking the heat for it. So we weren't the only reason that those governments introduced them, but we did give them the confidence that it could work. Second example, clothing. As I say, we shift about 400 million items of clothing a year. It's a lot of clothing. We know from work about 25% of it's going to landfill each year. That's bad. How do you encourage people to recycle more? We were struggling with it. And then Bright Smart in the business said, why don't we do a deal with Oxfam to encourage people to bring clothing back to Oxfam shops or to us to give to Oxfam. The money raised from that goes to help tackle poverty in Africa, a couple of million quid a year. People responded well to it. Several million items are now coming back, but it's 1 or 2% of what we sell, not 100%. But once you build people's confidence to actually start to think about not throwing clothing away and that it's easy to bring it back, you can start a second conversation with them in the future that says, now think about keeping your clothing longer. Longevity, quality, repair, does it have to be thrown away at all or returned? And then you can start a third conversation when you've been through that about a new service model. You start to rent clothing rather than sell it. Now that, we have to take our consumer on a journey towards. Let's be very, very clear about that. If we suddenly introduced it now in an average M&S store around the UK, people would just be overwhelmed by it and would just move next door to sort of a more traditional model. Now, my final point. So 2 little examples there. We all cast around for what are examples of success. Sustainable change is happening. I've seen 2 or 3 really exciting business models that are starting to deliver substantial sustainability change on consumption. They don't call themselves sustainability models. If you look at people like Zipcar, Airbnb, Kickstarter, Kiva, they're starting to give the consumer what they want, which is better product and service that we as professionals happen to do is better for the society and the environment, but they don't package it as that. The future is not about sustainability products, it's about better products for the consumer that happen to give these benefits as well. So lots for us to digest. I'm very clear that Marks and Spencer, like Tesco's and a number of others, have achieved a lot in this space already. We've done about 15% of the journey to be sustainable. And the number one challenge for us going forward is how we engage our consumers better going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Our final panellist contributor is Dr. Ute Collier, Team Leader for Buildings and Industry at the Secretariat of the UK's Committee on Climate Change, the independent body advising government on setting and meeting its carbon budgets. Ute, I think among the work that you've been doing recently is leading the committee's work on the UK's carbon footprint, which has sort of moved thinking to focus more on the importance of consumption and consumption-based emissions. So again, very relevant to this work. And before your work at the Committee on Climate Change, you managed the London Energy Partnership, and are therefore another example of our speakers who've navigated across different disciplines. So Ute, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether going last is a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I know you probably all want to go off to have a drink. However, I can pick up on lots of issues people have said before me, which is quite a useful thing. And when David, you did the introduction, you said that you hope the panel will help unlock low carbon behaviour, and I thought, gosh, that's a challenge, a very big challenge. And I think it's probably one of the things we struggle most with at the Committee on Climate Change. So, I mean, as you all know, we have our legally binding carbon budgets. We're trying to get to 80% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2050. And everyone knows that's a huge challenge. Now, I share an office mainly with economists. Gus has already talked about economists. I'm not one, but I know economists make a great contribution. But beginning when we started out, we were also chaired by an economist. So very much the sort of thinking, oh, let's do a little bit of economic modelling. We do our abatement potential modelling that way. So, you know, let's just populate these models with great things like, you know, electric vehicles and low carbon this, whatever. And of course we can do it. We can get to 80%, actually reasonably easily. But then if you drill down into some of the measures, of course you suddenly encounter these pesky things, humans, and the way we use energy, or even things like, you know, the way a builder puts in an insulation panel, which is never 100% good. So, you know, we have come to realise more and more that we need to look at behaviour, the way humans interact with technology. However, I mean, it doesn't mean we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think when Dale started talk about freezers and how you could just change the whole model, I thought, but hold on a second. I've just bought a new freezer, A triple plus, 149 kilowatt hours per year, which is a lot better than what I had before and a lot better than the worst appliances on the market. So in this case, technology can actually achieve a lot. Okay, if I didn't need to use the 149 kilowatt hours at all, I guess that would be better, but you're not taking into account that in that freezer I have the blackberries, which I didn't buy in Marks and Spencer's, but collected round the corner and keep me going. So that kind of thing. And I think we need to be careful. We need to, in some areas, actually technology can do a lot. And it comes back to some of the stuff you were saying about taking people on a journey. Well, let's not ask them to change the whole model of how they buy food and where they put their food and how they cook. That's maybe too much. In an area where, you know, we get savings of, say, 70% quite easily. But, and I bring my second example in, which is also a buildings example, and that's about how people live and the temperatures, which made me, I thought about that when I read your research project about the 22 degrees. I think that's actually mainly in offices, whereas the evidence is that in homes, temperatures have been going up as well. On average, 17.5 degrees is how people heat their homes, although obviously bedrooms are lower temperatures and then poor people can't do it. Heat to that, they can't afford it. So nevertheless, there is an issue there. Now, we do a lot of analysis where we look at, well, you know, how much abatement can you get from these different measures? Well, if you get 15 million homes turn down their thermostat by just 1 degree, take into account that a lot of homes are quite overheated and people insist on wandering around in t-shirts in the middle of the winter, well, you can save 5 million tonnes of CO2. And you also save, on current energy prices, I think just below £1 billion a year. I know there is your point, David, about the rebound effect. Let me not go there for now. Okay, so it's £1 billion saved. People are still generally comfortable, and it all seems to be a winner. If we try to save 5 million tonnes of CO2 through other measures, for example, solid wall insulation, which is a really difficult thing to do, you know, it costs us £17 billion. So I think with this big challenge, there is definitely a, you know, pick very carefully. There's, you know, we need to think about the costs, we need to think about how we can bring people along. Unfortunately, even with the loft example, there is a downside because, of course, that brings up the transaction costs. So, you know, is it worth it if you compare various measures, pounds per tonne of carbon? So none of it is easy. I think some of this research is really interesting. Yeah, you're right, we need more of it. It's certainly something we realise is a really big challenge. Unfortunately, we don't quite know how to answer it. Certainly, of course, we need to get better at doing stuff in government, you know, joined up thinking and all this, but, you know, that's not easy either. But, yeah, so my sort of conclusion of this is, well, let's pick our battles very carefully and try and bring people along where it's easy, and also let's not all, you know, the emphasis shouldn't just be on government. Yeah, I mean, things like campaigns NGOs can run on, you know, indoor temperatures could be useful, anything like that.
Thank you very much, Ute. Now, we're a little bit behind time, as I think it's sort of inevitable, really. So I'm going to move straight to questions from you. Now, there is at least actually it's 2 mics I can see. If you could hang on until you've got the mic, because this is being filmed, until you ask your question, and then if you could identify who you are, that'll make it more interesting as well. So I don't know if should we go over to the top right.
Hi, I'm Dan Epstein. I'm from a small consultancy company called Useful Simple Trust. I'm really interested in the drivers of social practice, the materials, competence and meaning. But I'm having a bit of a failure with my imagination. I can imagine lots of ways in which materials have driven massive social change. So oil, the car, suburbia, zoning and out-of-town shopping, those relationships, similarly with mobile mass and the web, and now social media, so very driven by the materials. Are there kind of ways or good examples of how competence and meaning have sort of driven real social change?
Yeah.
Dale, I think that feels like one for you.
Yeah. Okay. I'll give you one quite straightforward example, which is a scheme that was ran in Japan called CoolBiz, and the challenge for the Japanese Environment Ministry was to reduce the carbon emissions from their buildings, and the way that they did it is through a kind of three-pronged attack, which, whilst it was never described as a practice kind of approach, it actually fits the model. So they changed the default settings for the air conditioning so that it came on at 28 degrees and not 24 degrees. That's fine. The problem at that point in Japan is that people wore suits like this to work, very formal, and they got very hot, so then they had to change the forms, both the meanings attached to the clothes, what people understood to be the appropriate clothing to wear, and the forms of competence or the conventions of the way in which you might engage in active work. And they had a program, it was a basic marketing program called CoolBiz, and they managed to change all three, in our word, elements: the conventions, the meanings, and the materials, the air conditioning. And I can't remember the exact figures, but we did a survey of international behaviour change initiatives across the world, and this completely outstripped any of the others by some significant margin. It reduced the sale of neckties by 37%, so not good if you're a necktie producer, but it made a massive saving, and it changed the cultural norms and what is comfortable in those environments. So that was a good example of how you might deal with all elements to change a practice.
Do any of our other panellists want to comment? Otherwise, we'll move on. I think the mics move somewhere towards the front.
Adrian Henriquez, Middlesex University. Thank you very much for all the presentations, and it was interesting to hear about the research. We've heard about the research, we've heard about the scale of the problem which needs to be faced, and we've heard some good examples of particular elements of behaviour or practice. But what I'm interested in is what David North said at the beginning, is what does this mean for the future? So can I ask the members of the panel, what you think is the most significant policy which would promote sustainable consumption, and hopefully it can draw on some of this social practices research, but to my mind the most important element is what is going to make a difference to sustainable consumption.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want us to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In whichever order you like.
Okay, let's keep it short and simple. Proper carbon market with a proper carbon price.
Dematerialisation, so looking at how you can provide richness of experience in a dematerialised way. So the classic example, which we need to look at extending, would be when I was a teenager. If you wanted to listen to music, you bought a huge piece of plastic. Now my kids, get a bit of electronics, bytes down the wire, and we've dematerialised music. We need to be able to look at that along a lot of other things.
We can learn a lot from what's happened with the car industry. I think that's been a pretty good example of how policymakers have systemically driven a behaviour of a number, the grams of CO2 per kilometre, into all parts of people's thinking. The purchasing decision, the taxation decision, congestion charging has all been driven by that single number. So there's a lot we can learn from that. The second is recycling. If there's a consistent approach, not just in the UK but globally, to recovery of materials so they can be usefully reused, it will drive an enormous step change in the number of people participating in closed-loop economy.
Yeah, I don't think there is a single policy. Of course, it has to be a combination of things. Sorry?
Single most important.
Well, I can't even say that. I think for some things, so appliances, cars, whatever, the minimum standards combined with the labelling are really important. In other areas, it's the carbon pricing, so it just depends. But also, and that just pick up what you mentioned earlier, and we did this report on the UK's carbon footprint. a global deal on climate change is extremely important because we import something like 50% of our emissions at the moment, and they will only go down. Okay, sustainable consumption is important, but actually we need to get the emissions down everywhere else, carbon intensities across the world.
I'm a sociologist, so I can't do a simple answer, but I'll have a go. I hinted at the end. I think thinking about different ways of provisioning goods in a society is the key, and start to think about how you can make more collective and coordinated delivery of different goods and services. And my two pet examples are the online shopping or food delivery and laundry. And I think, having worked with some of Tesco's Club Card data and talked to Tesco's, their logistics for getting goods to stores is a world of, it's a work of art, and I think it is elsewhere. You think of the logistics of how those food gets from the store to the house, it's complete chaos. But people, people shop once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, they throw food away because it goes, you need some degree of collective coordination of the way food gets delivered to homes in ways that would reduce all sorts of different things. We used to have food delivery to home, so I'm not talking about something radical. We talked about this earlier on, and Gus was saying that this is how it was when I was a boy. Similarly with laundry, why are we washing our clothes? I do the laundry in my house, so it really bugs me. Why am I washing these clothes and then standing for ages ironing them? When somebody could come and take them away and bring them back for me already done. But it's cheaper for me to do that in the current market. But on scale, it doesn't necessarily need to be cheaper. And if we talk about good life and happiness, I've done quite a lot of work in time use, and people spend a large amount of their unpaid work time doing the laundry and food shopping, and people feel time pressured and unhappy by that, so you'll make everybody happy as well.
Thank you. You've got the mic there.
Hi there, my name is Ian Blight from Heriot-Watt University. Really enjoyed the session, really enjoyed the theoretical framework that's been applied here. As a consumer psychologist, it's a nice sort of step up from the very behaviour-driven approach that I look at. One of the messages I get from the panel is that, and from my work in sustainability, is there's huge latent demand for something to change. You talk about the levels of the consumers saying, do things. You can't go into a university without tripping over a sustainable development research unit of some description. We look at the governments. We can go from Al Gore in America, Robert Hill in Australia, John Prescott, your good self, as these big beasts in government who you would think should be able to drive change. I'm sure you can reduce people to tears at various times during your political career, but yet we're all failing. We're all hitting up against a barrier. We've got lots of ideas, and I don't know if we necessarily need more ideas. What I'm really interested in is what's the political practice that we're butting up against here? Because there is this demand from there, and there are these big beasts. But something happens in Westminster, something happens in government that just means that things are watered down and things disappear, and all of a sudden, zero carbon house. That doesn't really mean zero carbon. You can buy your carbon from somewhere else. So it's really a question for you, Gus. What's the practice we need to change in government?
Right, and I think governments respond a lot to public opinion. And if you want to know what the public think and do, then quite often we ask them. This is a massive mistake, right? Your customers, 88% of them say they care about the planet, and then they go and do things which are clearly totally contrary to that. So I think we need to understand that what we're trying to do is change behaviour, what people do, not what they say. And quite a lot of our evidence bases are about what people say, and that's a big problem. So if we can get to the stage, so people will say, I am strongly in favour of improving the environment, I'm strongly in favour of reducing CO2 emissions, and I've just bought my big new SUV, and boy does it go fast, right? So we sometimes, and politicians respond to that. They say, actually, people don't really care about this stuff as much as you think. They say they do, but they don't really, and they're going to vote for us if we reduce as the Daily Mail would tell us to do, reduce the price of petrol, make these things cheaper, and that'll be, people will feel better off and they'll be fine. So I think we need to get that, we need to think about education and ways of changing people's values in the first place, and we need to get a sustainable way of a real kind of core of pressure groups which genuinely want to change and which genuinely will work as in the sphere of political activism to try and get their message across with concrete policies. So one of the things we're talking about is if we're going to do anything about CO2 emissions, we need to do something global. Well, yes, absolutely. So you can try and do that, but it's politically, it's incredibly hard. And some people that are kind of saying they're in favour of it, in the end, scupper the international conventions. So it is very hard. I think we need to work a lot on trying to make sustainable policies good politics. So in other words, get the incentive structures right such that if political parties were to deliver really sustainable programs, they would get electoral success.
It's back to us.
Yes, I think so. You get the governments, it's a democracy, I'm afraid.
David, I think you wanted.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that as well. So I sort of agree with what Gus has said, but I think there's another dimension, which is we do need governments to hold their nerve when they're under pressure from business. So I used to work in business, and one of the things is when governments announce a proposed policy and consult on it, all the businesses that think this will be a bit of a nuisance and so on, campaign to stop it or to change it. Once the government says, fine, we've had the consultation, we've now decided, all that entrepreneurial energy and creativity and innovation that business is often so good at and much better often than government at, goes into working out, given the rules the government has said there are going to be and they're not going to change, how do we now address them? And I think sometimes government is too unwilling to say, no, here are the rules, let's stick with them. Let me just give a specific example. If you go and look on one of the boards, there's a lovely diagram of how originally there was a government policy on zero carbon homes which said all the carbon in a home is going to be counted. And there was a huge lobbying effort, not from the public didn't know about this, from the industry, who thought it was a bit inconvenient. The board's a bit more sympathetic to them than that. Anyway, WWF have been involved in that, the creation of that standard, that all the energy in a home has to be included when you look at zero carbon homes. And when the government capitulated to this pressure, in the end we walked out of the group, the steering group on this. Now WWF doesn't often do that, and apparently this went round Westminster as the panda flounce. But that's an example of where, once you hold the line, if you think of lead in petrol, you think of CFCs in refrigeration, all these things, there's a huge objection to it when it's announced. But once they understand that's what's going to happen, then business starts lining up to work out how we're going to deal with it.
Just briefly, David, I think a lot of it is about reframing the whole debate. If you think what Gus has just told us about what governments want, to me that's the whole green growth agenda. It's about showing how this approach will create jobs, it will save us money, it will reduce the pressure on the health service in the future. It's about reframing a positive frame of mind. Many people in business, many people in government still think these about negatives, and negatives are very hard to sell to consumers and to the electorate. We need a much more positive debate about the future.
We also need to get people to stop buying the Daily Mail, I think.
Thank you. Can we just have another show of hands so that our two colleagues who are sort of handing the mic around know where to go next? I think somebody's got the mic though.
My name is Albert Tucker, Renewable Power Exchange. I think you're beginning to move into the territory I want. I think because we're British, we try to avoid a discussion about culture. From what I've heard and from what I've read so far of the report, a critical thing for the scale you, David, asked for, and I think, Mike, you were beginning to move towards talking about Marks and Spencer's chain, is culture change. But from our discussion here, even as people committed to this, it feels like we're giving up on culture change because it's too difficult. Do we need to talk a little bit more about, in our organizations, when we want to do culture change, we focus in on culture change, not the logistics, not the delivery of the system, not the gubbins of it, but actually how are we going to deliver this culture change? But we kind of, in this kind of debate, we shirk away from it. And it's not just retail consumption we have here. We have energy consumption and how we do it. That's a highly traditional and rigid structure. So it seems to me, for the scale you demand, David, we need to start talking really amongst ourselves about how do we move culture change in the mass of the population. And that's a scary conversation, I understand, but I think I'd really like to hear a bit more about that. So my question, I guess, if I want to frame it as a question is it too difficult to talk about culture change? If it's not, what are the things we need to be thinking about to have that conversation?
It's a great question. Can I just offer two very, very quick observations? Firstly, the number one challenge for me about sustainable future is not one of technology, it's about hearts and minds. It's a human journey. And if people are not bought into that journey and a better way of doing things, we'll never get there, whatever technologies we come up with. So most of my job, and I suspect David's job when he was at Tesco's, is about hearts and minds of the business leaders that pull the lever to run the organisation. Once we can show our colleagues that you can run a better logistics fleet, because it's saving money by doing less miles, you can sell differentiated products to your consumer because they're seen as more ethical, people buy into it. Now that's what we do with 80,000 colleagues within an organisation. We've got to do it with 21 million customers. So I align with you on that one. The big issue for me is tribalism. People belong to tribes. They don't randomly knock around in life. They look around for reinforcement. So I'm a great believer that if we want to create a sustainable society, we have to work with the grain of the tribes that people belong to. It might be that they're all Jewish, they're all Manchester United fans, they're all Marks and Spencer shoppers. What are the identities that people congregate around and give them safety and confidence that change is possible? It's not just me, there's millions of people that identify that are coming with me. So the ability to align with those tribes that define people's lives both locally, nationally and globally will be incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, I've been some really quite interesting examples. I know British Gas ran this, what was it called, Green Streets thing a few years ago, and part of it was, well, you know, you compete with, your street competes with a neighbouring street, and people love that kind of thing. And I know when DEC was initially talking about the Green Deal, and solid wall insulation in particular, there were certainly all these ideas, oh, we need to have like a demonstration home in each neighbourhood so people can look and see it. And apparently people really like to have a lower energy bill than their neighbours. So that's part of the tribe thing, I guess. This is the neighbours as tribes. So it's all these things, but I'm not sure DEC's really still subscribing to all this.
I mean, I kind of wonder what we mean by culture or cultural change, but I mean, I think the key point that I would make here is that cultures are changing all the time. I mean, we haven't given up on cultural change because cultural change is everywhere. It's happening all the time. We actually have a very good understanding of cultural change. I mean, it's not to say that people listen to it, and some ideas trump other ideas, so they're quite limited. But we do have a good set of understandings about how cultures change. They change, their context specific. They're affected by your social networks and your relationships with other people. Might describe them as tribes. I'll describe them differently, but we're getting to the same point. You know, identities are actually incoherent and often contradictory at various levels, so people don't have they don't have a coherent narrative of a lifestyle on identity. So, you know, you have to play with those contradictions. But the key point is that cultures are always changing. They're not static. And so the point is then we need to understand how they change. Some of what we want to be doing is avoiding certain kinds of change. We might want to be avoiding practices like showering 4 times a day, emerging in other contexts, even if you know, that might be a bit hypocritical, given that lots of people, probably in this room, if the data's right, shower 4 times a day, although actually I guess they're not. There is an issue around, the issue around scale is absolutely critical. So we can often see cultural change through policy that's quite micro and small. How do you scale it up? And it's not simply make a bigger version of the small case. So we need to understand and explain why cultures change, and then think about producing or coming up with ideas of guiding that change in the right direction, because change and culture is always produced and constructed. So there's no, this idea that individuals kind of choose culture is to me anyway, slightly sort of balmy. They do to an extent, but our cultural choices, the way we live our life are shaped by simple things like the decision to grant Tesco's, sorry, keep on going to Tesco, David, grant them planning permission to build a supermarket. I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't plan build supermarkets, but when a supermarket's built, it changes culture, if that's the sense of culture that we're talking about. So cultures are always shaped, changing and constrained in different kinds of ways, and we need to be honest about that and think about what, it comes back to the question of what's the good life, what's the good society. That's the difficult question, because we don't necessarily agree on that, and maybe it'd be a problem if we did, I don't know.
Okay. We're getting a bit tight on time, so why don't we take 3 more questions, and then the panel can sort of, between them, work out which of those three they answer. There's a gentleman over there. It's all been the bloke so far. So there's a lady at the front here as well, and perhaps a chap in the sort of top left up there. Do you want to start back there?
Yes, hi. I found all of the presentations very interesting today. I'm Graham Randalls from the New Economics Foundation. We're not the kind of economists that you were referring to earlier, and we're very much interested in the economics of well-being, of happiness. We're very interested in different practices, such as we have done a lot of work into the idea of reducing the working week as one idea. But one of my questions really about business, and I think there's some very good examples of businesses that are using less resources to make the stuff that they sell. But I think there's still a big challenge around businesses still wanting to sell more stuff. And as much as we might sort of talk about wanting to consume less, if businesses are trying to get us to consume more so that they can sell more stuff, we're still going to have a problem. And government's probably supporting that because they're making tax revenues off the stuff that's sold. So how do we address that particular problem?
Take one at the front and then one at the back.
Bibina Histerman, co-author on a book on sustainability. Now, about 5 years ago, there was a Green Streets competition. And to all accounts, it was the children who were most active, told their parents, switch the lights off. And they were proud of solar panels and things of that kind. So, should the children not be involved, especially as it's their future that is at stake?
Johnny Hazel, Green Alliance. I'm very interested in the Common Cause programme of work and the role of values in changing behaviours. And the extent to which, picking up on Ute's point about a wider, not just expecting government to do everything, but a wider group of actors in society picking up this mantle, and the extent to which businesses can promote pro-social values, and whether there's a tension, whether they can bring the power that they carry to that problem, or whether there's a tension between, as the previous question described, their business models requiring consumption, whether that precludes them from trying to speak to consumers about values.
Okay, thank you very much. A couple of sort of business-focused questions. I don't know if you want to take those, kick off with those, Mike.
So I think in my opening remarks, I think I acknowledged that very great tension. The whole business model for all retailers, all brands, everybody in the world is basically predicated on selling more stuff. That's how you're rewarded by shareholders, how success is measured internally and externally. And I think we're saying now as businesses, we don't have the answer, but we recognise the limitations of the model we have now. And the recognition is largely driven internally. So I do not believe that consumers, shareholders or government will precipitate a sustainable retailing revolution. I think business will get there slightly earlier and recognise, whether for cost reasons or reputational reasons or opportunity reasons of exploiting a new marketplace, developing a new marketplace, businesses are going to start stepping into that place. So I ain't going to wave a magic wand to you. I'm acknowledging the challenge that you throw down to me. If I had that answer, I would be out the door and I'd have made billions by now. But the businesses that are able to migrate their existing business models from one driven on consumption of stuff to one that's driven by service will be the ones that prosper in the future, as well as all these new models that will emerge. The thing that's literally driven me great at Marks & Spencer over the last decade is migrating us on that path. It's easy to come up with a concept here, but I must deliver numbers today for the business and prepare for a radically different future as well. You're walking a tightrope, and that's the hardest thing to do, but I acknowledge the challenge you throw down.
Thank you. Dale, you said habits and routines are cultural, not personal. So, where do children fit in?
I think children. It depends on what you say when they should be involved. But yeah, absolutely, children are one important area to consider. I mean, if you think of eating habits and the way that eating changes, what the kinds of norms and conventions that we establish around school dinners, and the way that people get institutionalised into eating in particular patterns actually is really, really quite important. So yes, I think children are one important area. Yeah.
Okay, and thank you. Do any of our other panellists want to make any final observations?
Could I just say, the whole behaviour change, picking up the point was made, if you look at how much is being spent by the private sector to change our wants and our tastes, it's massive. The amount of money I had, the resources I had in government were absolutely tiny. An absolutely tiny fraction. The Behaviour Insight team was 8 people. The Mad Men had a lot more, right? And they managed to convince us all to buy cigarettes. So it's an unfair game. If we are going to try and change wants, we've got to kind of have a model of why we want to do that. And I think, and this is where the whole emphasis on moving away from an emphasis on GMP towards social well-being gets you into that. So what is it that really makes people happier? What is it that people will enhance their life satisfaction? It turns out that things like altruism are massively important, right? Doing things for others, not buying ever bigger things, particularly when you're trying to outcompete your neighbour and have a bigger car than them. So it is about values, and to be honest, NEF have done some fantastic work on this and are working on it, and there's a brilliant set of projects that NEF did some evaluation of, that the National Lottery looked at, spending about 140 million on well-being projects, which were things about healthy lifestyles, healthy eating, combating loneliness, 101 different things, but they are all about accepting the fact that we are going to change behaviours, and we're going to say that actually we can get into this really highly charged area of trying to change what it is people want, not accepting preferences and wants as given, and that's a big area.
I agree with that. I just want to make one sort of point really, which is when you come into the exhibition, we started with the office, and we have words like normal, habits and routines, and I think it's important to recognise that quite a lot of our actions, probably most of our actions, are not the consequence of deliberative thought processes, actually. They're habits and they're routines, however we might want to do that. So values, changing values, yes, it matters, it's a component, but there's a sociologist called Anthony Giddens who wrote something called about practical consciousness, yeah? And he said, you would never survive if you had to think about everything you did in a day. And the vast majority of what we do comes under a form of practical consciousness, habitual and routine, and it's that stuff that we have to address, as well as the values.
True, but it is worth pointing out that all of that's in Danny Kahneman's book about System 1 and System 2 thinking. And Danny Kahneman would describe what you've described as System 1 thinking. And all I'm saying is I'm not going to try and get the sociologists or psychologists, particularly given that I'm an economist, to say which one of these is right, but please speak to each other. That's my plea.
David, do you want to...
Well, just quickly, the other thing two things. I heard on the radio today, I can't remember the exact statistic, but that if you watch football on television, you're subject to, 11 sort of references to drinking alcohol per hour or something. It's just overwhelming. And so Gus's point about the amount of marketing and advertising is hugely important. The other thing I think we have to grapple with, linked to that, is how do we communicate and engage people on this? And just picking up on NEF, I think this is right, isn't it? You came up with an index about satisfaction levels of life in different countries, and it completely flopped. There was no interest in it. No one paid any attention to it. And then it was called the Happy Planet Index. It was given a different name, and suddenly it was all over the place. And it was about how do you communicate and engage people with this, and we've got to find better ways of doing that as well.
Ute, did you want to?
Yeah, just quickly trying to end on a positive note. You know, I came to this country, I don't know, must be 30 years ago. Well, certainly more than 25 because the Germans have taken the vote away from me. You know, there was a recycling culture in Germany. It didn't exist here. We got a recycling culture now. Germany has an energy saving culture. We haven't really got it. But I think it's the combination of the policy framework you saw. I know we've got Green Deal problems, whatever, but you know, we've got minimum standards from the EU for appliances, this, that and the other. I think we can probably get there. It just is a combination of things. So I think there are at least some examples of how things have gone the right way. So I'm hoping we're going to get there with some of it.
Thank you. Dale's given me the sort of cue about actions not being the result of deliberative thought processes, because I've been standing here, in fact, for about 10 minutes, sort of worried that I'm keeping us from the next part of the evening, which is the 11 references to drinking alcohol reception. All I want to say is that, you know, this. Thank you all for coming. This is a part in a process of debate and discussion. This work continues. Colleagues at Lancaster University are leading a new research centre called Demand, with a focus on everyday practices and energy consumption. And in other parts of UK academia, this work continues. I think with Gus's sort of plea in mind, really, which is work together, be multidisciplinary, and make it relevant to policy. A final plea, I have to do this, you know, on behalf of my own institute, the Sustainable Consumption Institute at Manchester, because we were set up actually with funding from Tesco originally, precisely to bring the disciplines together in the way that you and others have said, Gus, but also on the challenge that I think some of our contributors from the audience have sort of pushed on, which is okay, you bring the disciplines together, make it multidisciplinary, reduce the jargon and all that, but then how do we make that relevant to the work of policymakers and business, so that they all come together? And that's why we created the Sustainable Consumption Institute at Manchester. I'm pleased to say that in a sort of Blair Brown pact, I'm giving way as director of the institute to Dale Southerton in a couple of weeks now, beginning of October, and the new research director is Professor Andy McMeekin, who's sitting there. It's not just about Manchester. As I say, it's about Lancaster, Essex, many other universities. That work will continue. But thank you all for your questions, for your participation, for coming along. And could you join me in a final thank you to our excellent panel? Thank you.